Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. In 2013, the Socialist Workers Party, the largest far-left organization in Britain and the dominant group in the international network of socialist groups called the International Socialist Tendency, experienced a crisis that led to a large number of people, a large minority of members, leaving the group. At the heart of the crisis were the efforts of the SWP Central Committee, that's the group's top leadership body, to protect one of its members against allegations of sexual violence and to stifle criticism of the leadership's handling of the situation. Now, this experience has lessons for radicals everywhere, and it was touched on in episode 23 of this podcast, Sexual Violence, Feminism, and Socialist Organizing. I encourage listeners to check out that episode. But today, I'm glad to be joined on this episode of Victor's Children by two guests who are members of the SWP, one of whom has written a book about the group's 2013 crisis and the events that led up to it. So could you please introduce yourselves to listeners?
Hi, David. My name's David Renton. I'm a historian and barrister and member of the socialist group RS21.
Hi, David. My name's Sadia, Jabeen. I used to be a member of the SWP between 2004 and 2013. I worked as a full-timer for them for 4 years, and following on from that, I worked for Love Music, Hate Racism for 6 months. I'm now working in education, so I've not been involved in any radical left groups for quite a long time, I must say.
Thanks again for joining us to talk about this. So, Dave, you got this book coming out, which begins in 2013, but the sexual violence by SWP Central Committee member Martin Smith, who's known as Comrade Delta in the group's discussions of the case, took place earlier. So, could you tell listeners about what you know about what happened in 2009, 2010?
If it's okay, David, my book does start in 2009, but it really starts actually with things which Sadia went through. So I think the best person to start with is Sadia, if that's okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I first was made aware of what went on in early 2009. I was very good friends with Comrade W, and we were on a night out, and she basically came out with everything that had been going on. She was really upset, telling me she was very ashamed of what was happening. I remember we were up late that night, and she actually stayed at my house telling me all about what was going on. Essentially that Martin Smith, who was the National Secretary of the Socialist Workers Party at the time, was trying to coerce her into a sexual relationship. The following day, we actually told my partner Simon, who was actually working full-time for the SWP, and Martin Smith was his boss. I remember he thought it was a joke at first because he just couldn't believe that Martin would be capable of something like that. So from there, and this is quite relevant, is we spoke to a local member. I'm going to call her Rose, who was a member of the Socialist Workers Party, but she was also a member of the Disputes Committee. And we spoke to that individual because we thought we could get a bit of advice on what to do around the situation, because obviously Comrade W was very upset by what had happened. I felt that it was trivialized by that individual a great deal, who just kind of rolled her eyes and said, "Men, what are they like?" And then they went on to tell two other leading members in Birmingham, who were very, very good friends with Martin Smith, and the rest is history, as they say. What followed on from that was that we went to Marxham a couple of months later. Comrade W was really not in a good state of mind, really, around because of what was happening. She'd obviously now told us what was going on. She was very triggered by a lot of the events that were happening at Marxism, seeing him around, but also meetings that were going on around sexual violence. I was kind of felt a little bit like I was over my head with the whole thing, because I've never had to deal with anything like that before. And with her permission, I asked to speak to a comrade, somebody who was more senior than me, but who kind of, she'd had a lot of experience in the party, and I thought she might be somebody who might be able to help. So I spoke to her. Her name was Donna, and to get a bit of advice about what to do. But at that point, Comrade W didn't really want to do anything about it. She was still kind of processing what was happening. And then, really kind of it was myself and my partner who were kind of supporting her through this over the year. The following year at Marxism, she had signed up, but in between she'd kind of dropped out of activity a little bit as well, but she refused to come to that Marxism, saying that she couldn't be around the party, she couldn't be around Martin. And it was at that point that I with her permission, again, I basically, I spoke to other comrades and said, we need to actually do something about this. I spoke to, because I was working with Love Music, Hate Racism at the time. I spoke to a number of comrades. There was a group of us, about 4 of us, who sat down and had a conversation about this. They all knew her quite well. And we agreed that Viv Smith, who was a member, I think she was on the disputes committee, but she was on the central committee of the SWP, that we agreed we would speak to her, because we felt that she would be the most impartial member of the CC to speak to. We spoke to her, and again, when we told her initially, she kind of went, is this a joke? And she actually laughed because what she was hearing. But instantly she said, it's really important. We believe her. She was actually really, really great. And she kind of went on and spoke to other people on the central committee. In between then, I think this was an evening during Marxism that we had this conversation. The following day, myself and Donna started to get phone calls from Wayman Bennett, who was our boss as Love Music, Hate Racism. And I didn't answer the phone because I knew exactly why he was phoning me. Donna answered the phone to him, and he basically shouted at her and, told her that, he knew everything and he knew all about our little meeting. And, essentially he was accusing us of trying to take Martin down. Am I going on too long? Or is there's still quite a lot?
No, but I would just add, for the benefit of people who don't know the British far left as well. So Marxism, you're referring to, that's the annual festival that the Socialist Workers Party puts on in London as a big public event. And Love Music, Hate Racism is a campaign organization, which is essentially, is it a front group for the SWP, certainly led by the SWP?
Yeah, it's definitely led by the SWP, yes. Yeah, so leading members of the SWP are at the forefront of that organization. So okay, so basically at Marxism, I was contacted by a member of the Central Committee who actually came up to Birmingham and met with Comrade W. Comrade W asked me to be there, and she basically told her everything that had gone on. There was stuff that she told this member of the Central Committee that she hadn't told me before. So there was a lot of detail in this meeting. Following on from that, Charlie Kimber, who was now I don't think he was the National Secretary of the Socialist Party at that point, but he was on the Central Committee. He came up to Birmingham with the other member of the Central Committee who had interviewed Comrade W initially, and they basically said that Martin Smith's position would be heavily reviewed on the Martin Smith's position on the Central Committee would be heavily reviewed following everything that happened, and that they apologized for everything that had gone on. I remember asking at the time, does that mean he's going to be removed from the Central Committee? And it was very much a politician's response of, his position will be heavily reviewed. And that was that was the kind of the line, as it were. And then following on from that, we had the conference in 2011, which we're going to come on to in a little while, I believe. Or do you want me to just carry on talking about that?
Sure, please do.
Okay. So that was August time. when all of
sorry, I see Dave waving.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. There's just a couple of things I want to go back to, if it's right, before we get to 2011. 2011 is really important.
Yeah.
But there's just a few more things from 2010, if I can, just so they don't get lost. Two small things, one big thing. Two small things, just to help listeners who don't know the left in Britain, maybe, just to visualise all the stuff and the politics of what's going on. One thing Sadia said, and it's right, Martin Smith was the National Secretary of the SWP. And he's the National Secretary when the stuff is going on that Comrade W is raising, and when the first complaints start being made. And then later he's slightly removed. But in all this period, up to 2010, he's still National Secretary. The point is that the SWP is kind of an unusual organisation on the international left, in that it has a very, very high subspace. It's not at all unusual for members to be paying up to more than £1,000 a year in subs, sometimes a lot more.
This would be dues for people in North America, just to clarify the term subs. Yeah,
membership, subscriptions, dues, whatever. So the SWP's got about 3,000 members, but with this, it's able to keep a payroll of about 100 people altogether who are full-time staff, journalists, bureaucrats, regional people, whatever. The point about the National Secretary, and the reason why this is such a key role in the SWP, is the National Secretary is the head of the machine. They're the person who decides who get jobs. So, for example, Sadia's talked about her partner is a full-timer for the SWP. When he's confronted with the news that Martin Smith, the National Secretary of the SWP, his employer, his manager, his boss, has been doing something seriously wrong, you can imagine how difficult it is for someone in that situation to confront that and to then work out how they deal politically with it. Sadia's mentioned Marxism. That's it's SWP's kind of page to the world, its international conference. There've been times in the not that distant past when the SWP would recruit up to 1,000 people a year at Marxism. And we'll come on later to some of these clashes happening at Marxism, but it's an absolute terror point for the leadership that they could lose control of the event, that there could be bad news from their perspective emerging there. And the other thing, just in terms of how this is investigated in late 2010, when Sadia and these close group of comrades are bringing it to the SWP, the leadership of the SWP decide on what they call mediation, and that's the term they all use internally to describe what's going on. So they don't investigate, they don't try and find out what's happened right from the start. Their first chance, their immediate response to try and deal with this situation where their national secretary, their leader, is being accused of coercing women into sex. Their immediate reaction is we have to mediate. So we have to find a point which is the worst punishment he'll accept and the least bad thing she'll accept, and work out a compromise on that basis. Not in a principled way, just on what's the bureaucratic way of dealing with this. And you talk to Comrade W and she'll say things like, what's her focus? She wants him out of the leadership. She doesn't want him doing meetings anywhere near her. She wants him to be relegated to the extent that she would feel safe in the SWP. And the point is that having told these things, which Sadia's described brilliantly, people saying to Sadia and therefore to Comrade W, essentially Martin's going to be taken out of the job, almost definitely. The point is, all that he gets by way of punishment in this mediation is he remains part of the leadership, he remains full-time working for the SWP. The deal that's done is that he'll be slightly relegated from National Secretary to head of the SWP's industrial organisation. And when W hears the news, she's so horrified she quits. So all that's gone on in 2010 before we get to the 2011 conference, which I'm sure Sadia will want to tell you about.
Please, let's hear what happened at the 2011 conference.
Okay. Thank you for that, David, because there's just so many things that happened that you just forget. So the 2011 conference, they actually held a special session at 2011 conference to talk about but not talk about what had happened. And it was Alex Kalinikos who led this session, and he basically said I'm sure David has probably got a much better memory than me, but he said something along the lines of that there was a young woman in the party who had accused Martin Smith of something. Is that correct, David? Do you remember?
Yeah, I mean, basically, he's just very coy and very vague. And he says there's
Yeah.
been a relationship breakdown, and he makes it sound like nothing really bad has happened or is alleged.
Yes, that's right. And then they say, as a result of this, Martin Smith is no longer going to be the national secretary, and Charlie Kimber will be instead. And then they allowed Martin Smith a right of reply, basically, to all of this. And I remember I was standing at the back with a couple of friends. I wasn't sitting with the rest of the Birmingham contingent at that point. And I remember just standing there absolutely horrified at Martin, first of all, just getting up and talking about, I think it's because something had been leaked on one of the leftist blogs as well, hadn't it, at the time. And he was talking about how, it's none of anybody else's business if he wants to be in a consensual relationship, and it's just people, trying to discredit our organization. And there was foot stomping and cheering and clapping, and there were just a number of us, so just standing there, just absolutely horrified at what was going on. There was a member of the Central Committee, Hannah, who actually I saw her walking out of the room. And then following on from Martin's speech, then a number of women comrades were lined up to defend him. There was somebody who famously said, "Oh, we all have skeletons in the cupboard." There was somebody who basically said she couldn't give a fuck what happened. I don't care. He's our national secretary, etc., etc. There was somebody from Birmingham, somebody who actually knew Comrade W quite well. And when she first got wind of this, back in 2009, she thought that, by taking Comrade W out for drinks and trying to get her a bit drunk, she would get her to talk about what was going on. And she kind of spoke in defense of Martin as well. And then I remember kind of just going, somebody's got to say something. And I went and found somebody. I went, I need to speak. And I just remember it was kind of a bit hazy now, but I remember it being, were you there, David?
I think I was in the venue, but I wasn't in the room because I think I was doing the crash at that exact moment.
Oh, okay. But I just remember, I just felt like the room was deadly silent. And I basically, got up and spoke, and I said, there's clearly something serious has gone on, that the Central Committee have taken this decision. And I don't think that, we should be celebrating, I can't remember what I said now, but essentially that, we can't, we can separate these two things. Yes, something's gone up on one of the leftist blogs, and we need to, argue against that. But also, we can't also take away from the seriousness of the thing that's gone on. And then, I said what I said, and I went off, and then I went and stood at the back again with my friends. And then this leading member from Birmingham marched up to me and had a massive go at me and went, "How dare you say something like that," without giving anybody else the chance to come back at it. And this was the person who had spoken earlier. And then basically, like, my friend had to stand in between us because she looked like she was going to punch me. And then afterwards, I remember there was all kinds of stuff that was being said. I remember I heard it myself. A lot of people going, "Oh, she just had mental health problems." This was all in the building at the time. "Oh, it was just a relationship gone wrong. Oh, she threw herself at him." This is all revolutionary socialists who are saying this. I do remember there were a number of people who came up to me and thanked me for speaking, because they said they felt really uncomfortable throughout the whole, Martin speaking and all the people speaking in his defense. And then that was the Saturday, and then there was a whole other day, the following day. I don't know if you remember much of that, David.
Honestly, no.
I remember the following day, there were still people coming up to me that day, clearly wanting to know something. Because my partner at the time, he was the full timer for Birmingham at the time. And I remember people had gone up to him saying that I should have been shot for the thing that I had said. And my partner went, "Yeah, that's my partner you're talking about. And maybe she knows something, which is why she said what she said." And then I remember there was that leading member from Birmingham again who decided that she was going to speak to me on the Sunday. And she said, oh, I'm sorry for what I said yesterday, but we've decided that we're not going to talk about it anymore. And I said, I don't want to talk about it with you. And she went, good. And then that was the end of her, that was her trying to shut down everything, shut down the discussion about it. I think that was about everything that I can remember about the 2011 conference.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ben. So in 2020,
can I chip in before we move on, if it's right? Sorry,
please.
Just because people have picked up. I wasn't in the room, but I have spent quite a lot of time talking to people there and getting like extra details. And I think they're worth, again, helping people to visualize this, getting a sense of the politics of what's going on. I mean, like, Sadia's absolutely right that Martin Smith was completely unrepentant in that room and completely giving a message to the SWP. He used words like, I'm no angel, and that's how the speech is remembered on the left. He described himself as happy as a pig in shit about being moved from National Secretary to the role. So he made it sound like this was all his decision. He hadn't done anything wrong. There are people who describe to me just as, the words used by people who are in the SWP who are instinctively pro-leadership. And they're, you can hear them at the back of the room whispering to each other that, the woman is just bitter because he ended it. I think Sadia really, people listening to this should have a sense of the enormous bravery of what Sadia was doing just by standing up in front of a room of 500 people and saying, there's more going on here. There's more than the party's telling you. And it's very clear to me that, later we're going to get to an SWP that's almost riven into two opposed blocks. But this is the moment at which people who later are going to want to be part of the opposition, this is the moment they realise there's something going on that they need to attach themselves to. It's because of Sadia's speech. But look, the other thing I just want to say is although Sadia does an incredibly brave and impressive thing by speaking, and that changes the history of the British left as far as I'm concerned, her intervention, it's in the room when the SWP delegates are confronted with the news that the National Secretary Martin Smith is being stood down, they respond by cheering him. They stomp with their feet on the ground. They chant, "The workers united will never be defeated." Okay, they fill the hall with the noise of their celebrations of what looks like his victory. Sadia's mentioned a Comrade Delta, and I interviewed her for my book, and she used an extraordinary phrase to me, a black woman who spent her life fighting racism. And she said to me, being in that hall, she said, it felt like being in a police federation conference.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. So the following year in 2012, W rejoined the SWP. Can you then tell us what happened between then and the Socialist Workers Party conference in 2013?
Okay. Do you want me to start with this, David?
I think so, because look, the point is all the time till we get up to 2013, you're actually right at the centre of the fire. So I think it's far better if you lead off and then maybe I chip in a few extra things after.
Okay. Yeah, sure. 2012, I can't remember exactly when in 2012 she rejoined. I remember, I'd kind of moved, Simon and I had moved house and we kind of ended up moving quite close to where Comrade W was living. So I was seeing a lot more of her that summer. And, she was talking about it a lot. And I think she was ready to actually deal with this properly, and she wanted to deal with it properly. And one of the things, we did discuss the idea of her going to, the police, and she didn't want to do that. She didn't want to, she felt that the police would just humiliate her, and she wanted to go to, the SWP leadership. She wanted to go to the disputes committee because she had faith that they would deal with it properly and, from a revolutionary socialist standpoint. And so it was kind of early autumn time, in 2012 when I made the phone call to Charlie Kimber on her behalf and said, look, this is what she wants to do. I think before then I'd had a conversation. I was at a Love Music Hate Racism thing in London, and I'd had a conversation with Hannah, who was a member of the Central Committee, and So when Comrade W kind of went, yes, I definitely want to do this, I made a phone call to Charlie Kimber, and he put me in touch with Pat Stack, who was the leader of the SWP's disputes committee. And I mean, that was very early on in the autumn time of 2012. And the whole situation was just a little bit bizarre, because I got a call from somebody else on the disputes committee going, right, okay, if you want to have it in Birmingham, can you please find us a venue? So I had to run around finding a venue that would take us for an entire weekend, that had separate rooms that we could use for the entire weekend and everything. And it was, like we had to do all the work to try and facilitate this disputes committee hearing taking place. Before the hearing took place, Comrade W was asked to write a statement. That statement was, sent to the disputes committee, who then passed that on to Martin Smith. When she asked to see his statement in response, she was told that she wasn't allowed to see his statement. So he was able to see exactly what she'd said, and he was able to then, build his side against that, in response to that. But she was not allowed to see anything about what he had said in response. We were told that we had to keep it very confidential. We were told we weren't allowed to speak to anybody about it, which myself, Simon, and Comrade W didn't. Except for the people that she wanted as witnesses. So, that was Viv, who was a member of the SWP, of the SWP Central Committee. We asked a couple of other people who didn't come and give evidence, or who didn't respond, actually. And then the hearing took place, and, there were a number of awful questions that were asked of her, and it was, an entire weekend of just us sitting in this room where, we would go in and out of the room where they were holding the hearing, and, awful questions were being asked of all of us, but in particular, this young woman who had brought this very serious allegation. And then I just remember the outcome when the outcome of the hearing, and just how it just completely broke us. It broke her in particular. But then just the aftermath of it and everything, we were just completely broken by it, because we just did not expect, and maybe we were naive, but we just did not expect the outcome to go the way that it did. Just some of the questions that were asked of her, she was asked about previous relationships, because, she was very young. She'd mentioned that she'd only ever been in relationships with boys her own age. And then they started asking her about other relationships she'd been in. There was somebody who thought that he was on a date with her or something, and they asked her about him, and he actually came and gave evidence against her. She was I can't remember. She was asked. Yeah, you may remember some more, David, because you spoke to her more recently than I did about what else she was asked. But yeah, it was the whole kind of situation, the disputes hearing and the outcome was just it really did. It just broke us at that point. So yeah, is there anything you want to add to that, David?
A few things, if I can. I mean, small things to do at the start of the year, because W's rejoined by the start of 2012. There's a demo, I think, in Leicester in February that year against the EDL.
Yeah.
And Debbie, I do want to say, for the benefit of people listening, Debbie's a younger comrade than Sadia, but she's a smart, intense political activist who's been through a bunch of experiences which aren't just SWP experience, and has a worked out idea of what she wants from this situation. And for example, while she's been out of the SWP, she's been working on a rape crisis hotline. But the thing which really freaks her out is going on this demo in February and seeing Smith and Howard swaggering around, chatting with everybody. And there's a moment when she sees them handing out placards to just teenage girls who come on the demo. And this she finds really upsetting, because she can remember how young she was when their relationship started. She was 19, he was touching 50. And she finds herself thinking just, oh my God, if I don't complain, this whole pattern's going to repeat itself. Mm-hmm. Sadia described the disputes committee. I mean, one thing to mention again, which is because Smith is the national secretary, and this is really important for later, because he's got this role where he's the top of the machine. The people who are on this disputes committee, people who are all people who've either been part of the SWP leadership recently, people who've been appointed to role by Smith, or people who've been beneficiaries for that system. That's why they can't really look at this as if there's any possibility that W's really telling the truth. And in terms of the questions, I haven't got more in terms of what W's asked, but after W gets this initial, no, we're not going to take action against Smith. What happens quite soon afterwards is another woman comes forward, a woman called Jen Wilkinson, and she has her own story of being harassed by Smith. And at this point, all she's saying is that she's willing to give her evidence in support of W's case. So there's another separate hearing just with Jen Wilkinson. And it's there that we've got the really documented questions. One member of the disputes committee asks Wilkinson, because Wilkinson's whole case is that she's had Smith repeatedly badgering her to sleep with him, not drinking himself, but just pouring alcohol down her, desperately trying to get her drunk so that she'll agree to have sex with him. One member of the panel investigating says, don't you think Martin's just generous? Whenever I go out for a coffee with Martin, who always buys me coffee. Another asks Jen Wilkinson, are you someone who likes to have a party? So you get this really horrendous list of sexist questions. And just the only other thing to mention, I mean, Sadia did mention that there's one member of the committee, its chair, Pat Stack, who's supportive. At the end of these panels, he takes the decision that disciplinary action should be taken against Smith. And he'll be a very important figure in 2013, Stack, because he plays that principled role. But the rest of the committee all end up basically deciding, no, we're not going to do anything. And they give this sort of perfunctory document a few lines long, just saying, we won't even really give you reasons for why we've reached the decision. But you need to know our view is that nothing should be done about Martin Smith.
Okay. Can you take us now through the main events of the momentous year 2013?
Well, should I do it all, Sadia? Because there are 2 points where you're really important. You're really important at the start, and then there's a moment at which you resign. But if I can do the whole year, and then you chip in at the end.
Yeah.
The SWP has 3 conferences in 2013. The first in January, where the majority of members learn for the first time what's happened and are shocked. A number of people speak. Sadia speaks, saying that this disputes committee needs to be rejected. So does Pat Stack. In a very similar way. But the conference ends up voting by 231 to 209 to approve the report and to take no action against Smith. And really there, all I just want to emphasize is this is the closest vote that the SWP's had in its modern history. It's the only time the leadership's ever come close to losing on anything serious. And in the end, it being as close as 20 votes in it is a sign of how shocked people are when they first begin to hear about what's happened. What Sadia said earlier about all the people around Comrade W keeping the story secret, not spreading the news till then, but then it's out. The report goes up online. At the same conference, there are votes taken to expel group of SWP members called the Facebook Four, who are 4 comrades who've been discussing how to join in and support this challenge, and the conference votes to exclude them. There's a special conference in March where people protest, try and take that up in the branches, and try and force the organisation to have a recall conference, see if we can reverse the vote. The opposition gets that conference called, but for reasons that just take too long to explain, the SWP has a really undemocratic structure for electing people to conference. The conference is heavily gerrymandered, and there's actually a much bigger pro-leadership majority by then. A key role is played by Alex Klinikos. We might come back to him later. He writes an article called Is Leninism Finished? And what he does, and this is central to the whole SWP method for dealing with this stuff, is to rebadge this and say, look, okay, there's been a complaint. We can't tell you about what the complaint was about, who it involved, anything. We'll accept in vague terms there's been a complaint. But the key thing to understand about what's going on is the complaint's irrelevant. What's going on is that there are just a bunch of SWP people. We all thought were good Marxists. Now we realise they're not. They hate Marxism. They hate Leninism. They hate the method the SWP has of choosing its leadership, which actually is an extremely undemocratic method of choosing its leadership. Which Alex Klinikos has been on for 30 years at this point. And he rebadges the questions all being about loyalty. What matters is not what happened to Martin Smith. What matters is the outrageous, shocking thing is that a bunch of just ordinary SWP members who don't really share in our politics anymore have decided to be disloyal to leadership. And that's how people try and sell the conflict to Marxists in the SWP, outside the SWP and outside Britain. There's a huge revolt in July by the opposition who threatened to withdraw speakers from that event. Because it's this big public-facing event for the SWP, that really destabilizes the leadership. And after about 6 months of them maintaining the fiction that Smith has been vindicated and there's nothing really to worry about, they agreed to have a second disputes committee, which will look at not W's complaint, that in theory had its final answer, but Jen Wilkinson's complaint of sexual harassment by Martin Smith. And that body eventually by, I think it's either August or September, says that Martin Smith has a case to answer. And he preemptively resigns so that he doesn't get this negative news and so that he doesn't have to give his version of events. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of the year, you have the December conference. SWP now much smaller, much older. The opposition, a large number of opposition has already left. Some of us cling on till the end of the year, and we're outvoted at that conference by about 450 to 70, with the people who already made a decision to stay in the SWP effectively deciding to give the leadership of the SWP retrospective backing for everything they've done through the year. Now, look, there's two things I've really rushed through there. One is the January conference where Sadia is the speaker. I'm sure she'd want to talk about that. And of course, there's also the question of what you do in response to all the shenanigans you see during that year.
Yeah, I mean, just on the 2013 conference as well, Comrade W wanted to attend that conference. Simon and I were elected by our district to not attend that conference unanimously. But Comrade W actually put a special request into the Central Committee saying that she wanted to attend that conference so she could give her side. She was, absolutely told by Charlie Kimber, and I remember the phone call, you will not be allowed to attend the conference. And she said, I want to attend the conference because I want to give my side. Well, Sadia can speak on your behalf, but you will not be attending the conference. I remember it exactly like that because he spoke in this really patronizing tone to her, really condescending, and all she wanted to do was just go and say her piece. And as a result of that, what we did do was she came to London with us anyway, and she waited outside. And then there was a member of somebody who actually spoke in that session and went and basically said she was not allowed to come to the conference, but if any of you want to speak to her and hear her side, she will be outside. And then lots of people came out, and we all went for a drink and did hear what she had to say. The special conference in March, we tried to go to that as well, and we were not elected to go by our district again. Funny that. And then it was just 2013 was just a shit show, wasn't it? It was one thing after the other, and it was essentially, I think it just got to the point where I just thought I just can't do this anymore. And it was, God, who did they expel? It was in about June, July time, they expelled someone. Was that the Facebook 4 at the time or somebody else?
They didn't. That's the second group of, it was four people again, and they didn't actually expel them. They suspended them, but withdrew them because of the Marxism strike.
Oh, right. Okay. But yeah, I remember at that point, I just went, I've had enough. And I'd already written about 20 draft resignation letters, and which were really, really lengthy. And in the end, it was just really simple. And I just went, I've got nothing left to say apart from I know the truth, and so do you. And, that's it. I'm going. And it was only at that point that a member of the Central Committee, Michael Bradley, decided to ring me to try and have a discussion with me. And, nobody was interested in wanting to speak to me before then. But it was more about, oh shit, she's left. Okay. We can't hold her under any kind of discipline anymore. So she's going to go off and say whatever she wants. And that's very much what it felt like, that it was about trying to damage limitations and everything. That was the end of my journey in the SWP at that point. So I don't think I have really much else to add to 2013, really, apart from those.
Thanks. Dave, is there anything you'd like to add about 2013?
Just a couple of sentences. I mean, what people need to think about this, need to just bear in mind, is just all through this year, people are protesting. The SWP has a very undemocratic system for its leadership contests, has a very undemocratic system for sending people to conference, but it does sort of have, in theory, regional meetings where people can carry on protesting. So every time there's a regional meeting, there's a member of the opposition getting up and saying, this is disgusting, people should be elected to go to conference. There's this almost masochistic determination by some of us to stay till the end. As Sadia's described, she hands in her resignation letter. I think it's sort of late summer, isn't it? I'm in that group of oppositionists, the last group to go in December. You mentioned the Conference Arrangements Committee. One of the interviews I did, I actually managed to find someone who'd been on the Conference Arrangements Committee. This comrade called Rachel, who's worked in the mental health system and has been around a lot of people who have sort of survivors of sexual violence. And so this is between you asking, can Comrade W go there, and before you get the refusal, the SWP Central Committee very bureaucratically take it to this committee, and there's Rachel there going, what the hell are you doing? And they're going, well, we've taken this decision because, she's a woman, she won't understand things, she doesn't understand what she needs. We've decided it's in her interest that she doesn't get to see conference. And just this Rachel just going to them like, what the fuck? This is the most patronizing thing I've ever heard. And that small exchange on that one committee is kind of like the SWP year of crisis in a nutshell. I do want to say, I should mention passing, there were two oppositions. There were a group of people who ended up leaving, after special conference, they become an organisation called the International Socialist Network. They're those of us who stay to the end of the year. We basically become a group called RS21. I do also want to say, there are lots of people who are trying to help the opposition. There are people in Britain who are signing open letters, sending messages of support. And frankly, there were a lot of people internationally who did that too. And those things helped give us the strength to keep on going, Actually, they were really, really important. And the comrades who saw them are really grateful for them, frankly.
So by the end of the year, can you just sum up the story? Say roughly what percentage of the membership and of the most active layer of the membership has left, do you think? As the Central Committee essentially is prepared to pull the roof of the house down in order to try to stay in control?
Well, the SWP essentially has about 3,000 subs-paying members at the start of the year and essentially around 2,000 at the end. So that's about a third of the subs-paying membership. But there's different ways of counting it because, for example, another estimate is if you look at the people who were at the regional meetings that elect people to conference at the start of the year, and that's a far better indicator of the SWP's active membership, about half of them have left by the end of the year. So a serious chunk of the membership goes, but the SWP holds on to, the key thing for it is these older, more passive members who pay a very high portion of their income in subs and therefore mean you can sustain the full-timers. That infrastructure is very badly damaged, but it survives and, in a sense, is able to regrow in the last couple of years in Britain as memories fade about all that stuff. And they've still got the money and the full-timers to be able to intervene in demos, etc.
So in recent years, the party leadership has admitted that mistakes were made in 2013. So can you just tell us what's been said and what's actually been done? And what do you make of all this?
Shall I go first, Sadia? I could do what's been said and maybe you do the political analysis of it.
Don't know about that, but yeah, you go ahead. Yeah.
So, look, there was, even in 2013, there was theoretically this apology, but it was a mad apology because it was apologising to everyone who'd been involved in the dispute in any way. So that means like Martin Smith gets an apology too. No one is named specifically in this apology. Nothing is said specifically about what they're apologising for. And the basic apology is not for any of the handling of anything. It's actually for, essentially for, we're apologising for the fact that this got online. And that it's got noticed by a bunch of people. And that's the 2013 apology. You get a flavour of it because there's a comrade from Manchester, no longer in the SWP, but was in that year and had been on the disputes committee, a member of the SWP. And she says, I'm willing to apologise, but I'm not ready to say sorry, which is a great summation of that first apology. Then there's another apology in 2024, and maybe Sadia, you can talk more about like your political assessment of it, but just to describe the content of it. This is how it comes about. In 2024, the SWP started to recruit because they've kept their full-time organisation. They've got some young members. And what happens is the young members are banging on the door and saying, we want to know what's going on. We want to understand what happened in 2013. And after a lot of internal protests and a lot of internal fighting, they're able to force 2 meetings with the SWP hierarchy, each of which is supposedly going to explain what happened. And the first meeting lasts for 90 minutes. And they start explaining what happened 80 minutes in, and they manage to clutter the event with so many other items on the agenda that there's no explanation at all. And everyone goes, this is ridiculous, we have to have meetings. So they force another meeting, and they get a longer explanation. And there are all these mad things said at the meeting. Like, there are members of the Central Committee come and say, well, I played a very principled role in 2013. I was on the side of the faction. I go, no, you weren't. That's why you're still the leadership. Well, I was on the side of the leadership too. And all these other great non-explanations. And after which the SWP publishes an apology, which initially it tries to keep very secret. So it's on its website, but it's not circulated internally. Yeah. Very few members of the organisation, except for these students, know it's made its apology. And now they're willing to say that the SWP had a process that was bad, and they are apologising, and it feels like the apology in theory is pointed at the women. But let's go through some really basic things. They don't contact the women and ask them their opinions of it. They don't have any dialogue with them at all. I have to go along to Comrade Delta, and I'm the person who shows her this purported non-apology, because no one's phoned her up or got her even made any attempt to contact her and ask her if she'd accept this supposed apology. It doesn't apologise for anything. And as I say, at least initially, they keep it pretty hidden in terms of the organisation. It's only after actually people outside the organisation saying this is a ridiculous non-apology that it gets a bit more traction within the SWP. And then the last thing is, just in the last few weeks, the SWP has been in the news quite a bit because they're trying to do entry work in your party, which is this new left party that's being formed that might hopefully contest elections in May. The SWP is trying to get a space within that. And as that's become something people are discussing, more and more people have been bringing up, the events of 2013. And they've actually taken a decision in the last few weeks to remove from the leadership the 4 people who were in the leadership 2013 and still on the Central Committee. So, for example, Alex Klinikos. Again, no real accounting for why they've got to remove him or what anyone did wrong. But that's where we've got to. So, but I think, Sadia, you could do the political analysis and how that feels to the people who are right at the heart of things.
Yeah, I mean, I've just pulled up the non-apology, and it says a lot without saying very much, really, doesn't it? It's just spiel, and it was. I mean, we saw it last year, and it was just kind of like, it was just too little too late, basically. You had a very long time to apologize and put things right when it mattered, and you didn't. And like you say, David, there was no attempt to contact any of the people who were affected by all the awful decisions that were made. And, it was just, it felt very much like we'd better say something because all these new young members that we're getting are being told that this awful thing happened and we need to put our line forward. That's my kind of take on it, really. And and I've heard things that others have been saying, and I was on a Palestine demo about a year and a bit ago, and a current member of the SWP came up to me and decided that was the time that they thought fit to apologize to me for all that awful stuff that happened. And I just kind of thought, this is not the time and place. But also, it's just, it's all well and good apologizing 10 years, 11 years after the event have taken place, where really you've done very little to actually put things right. And, I'm just looking at one of the things where it says, for clarity, the person against whom the allegations are directed has not been a member of the SWP since 2013. Yes, that's correct. You didn't expel him. He resigned so he wouldn't have to have a case to answer. You didn't actually take any action against him. There's just, it's too little too late is my takeaway, or what, and has been my takeaway from all of that, really. So
and just on Martin Smith, I mean, for a long time after 2013, you could go to SWP events, social events, and Martin was still an honoured guest. All those bloody long-standing members of the SWP were desperately sharing his blog. They managed to, between them, they managed to line up a nice paid PhD job role for him to move into. And they, for a long time, they were still treating him like their comrade. I think they do that less these days, but that's only because, there has been some turnover of membership and there are new people in the organisation now. And the people who weren't members in 2013 would be quite shocked if the old guard tried to pull that again. But that's as far as they've gone on that one.
So thank you for giving us such an account of the disgraceful actions of the Central Committee through those years. And it brings up the question of how we explain those actions and why so many members supported the Central Committee against opposition and against criticism. So what do you think about why the majority of the Central Committee conducted itself the way that it did and why most members in the end supported them?
You taking this one, David?
Okay. I'll have a go, but I'd be really interested to see what Sadia says. I think the two things I say in my book that you've got to sort of really understand in terms of the SWP are the democracy and the SWP's position on the women's question. And just, I'm not even suggesting that every left-wing group always gets the politics of that latter issue brilliantly. But the SWP does have a particular and quite bad take even compared to the rest of the far left. But on democracy, I just see this in respect to the leadership protecting one of their own. That's why the Central Committee decided initially the key thing in 2010, before anyone knows, before it has any need to cause the organisation any harm, any at all, the reason why they fix on mediation is because they don't want to have to explain that they're sacking Martin Smith. They don't want to have to explain why. They are people who have a very high exaggerated sense of their own worth. They cannot admit that one of them was doing wrong. And then you see that same problem of democracy as you go through all the various individual bits of the SWP. The Disputes Committee hearing it in 2012. They're generally former members of the CC. They simply cannot believe that someone who's been in SWP leadership, this is a top-down party where the leadership are expected to lead the international working class into revolution. It's simply impossible that anyone in that position could have had sex with a woman without her consent or could have pestered another woman to sleep with him. And that just same problem goes on as you go through the bulk of the membership. A lot of what I'm trying to do in the book is just bring up quotes and instances from these various local leaders of the SWP, all of them essentially saying versions of the same thing. Leading comrade from Sadia's and Comrade W's district at the 2013 conference, calling for a purge of people from the SWP CC leadership who are seen as like not having the right position on Martin Smith. And the argument he gives is, quote, and I remember him saying this because I was in the room. He said, Sadia, a teacher comrade.
Yeah, I know exactly who you mean.
We're going to the barricades. If the Central Committee can't unite, there'll be a problem. And that just notion that people have in their heads that in 5 or 10 years' time, but definitely not longer, the SWP is going to lead the whole international working class, several billion people in revolt, and they're pre-selected a leadership so talented, they're already ready to play that role, is just absolutely very odd indeed. When you then face up to the people who have that position, a lot of whom are just absolutely people who have no personality, absolute time savers, people who moved up the hierarchy by doing their best not to say anything, do anything, make enemies of anyone. And that whole SWP notion that, they are already the leadership of the whole working class, just waiting to get the position which history has allocated them, just makes them incredibly badly placed to look with any honesty when one of them is accused of wrongdoing of this seriousness. But the other points to kind of I think, David, you've referred it to me in some of our discussions over the years. You talked about it as anti-feminism. The SWP does have quite a distinctive position on the women's question. And the first time you hear it, it doesn't sound that bad. What the SWP says is that the organisation supports women's liberation. So it has a notion that not all women, but particularly working class women, are going to be the vanguard of resisting sexism. So they see sexism as an issue. The problem is that that's always been subservient to this kind of deep idea in SWP thinking that in order to defeat sexism, what you have to do is you have to have unity of male and female workers, and that anything which undermines that unity is disastrous, and it can't even be admitted, even if it's true. And, so for example, the SWP founder, Tony Cliff, writes, in the early 80s, a book, God, Sadia, no one reads this book, and I don't have the title in front of me, but it's something like Women's Struggles and Class Struggles or something. You find it and tell me I've got it wrong.
Class Struggle and Women's Liberation was the name of the
lovely.
book.
David, you're the one who's correcting me.
That's
but there is, there is this book, and it's kind of embarrassment for this SWP. It's like, of all Tony Cliff's books, it's the one which people are least likely to be made to read these days. But there's never been an accounting with the bad arguments from it, and the arguments hang around. And one of his arguments in relation to interpersonal violence is that essentially this is an issue which you shouldn't talk about, because even raising it is naturally dividing men and women, and it's saying that men can be a problem when what you need to be saying is that men aren't the problem, capitalism and sexism are the problem. And what that just means is whenever you've had discussions about intimate violence, sexual harassment, rape within the SWP, they've always been really odd. The SWP in all its myriad publications, there's never been a comrade who's just gone, okay, why do rapists happen? Why did rape happen? Well, first we need to think into the mind of rapists. You cannot even see this as an issue of rapists, because that's to assign too much explanatory power to ordinary men. What you have to do is you have to talk them out of the picture. And the other thing about the SWP, that's been bad, but to be honest, the SWP was full of people who were quite willing to disregard bad bits of their training. People could have probably got past what I've just described. The thing they couldn't get past was the interaction of sex and class, and seeing these two things as combined. To my mind, really interesting people, when they write on the left and they write about sexual harassment, get that a lot of what goes on with sexual harassment isn't just sex power, but it's also class power. It's managers having a relationship with junior workers. It's very, very, very rare indeed for a man to go into a workplace and seriously try to sexually harass their boss, because the boss can just sack them. The manager can just sack them. And the SWP's not just bad at seeing these two things as joined up, but is incredibly bad at seeing all of these issues joined together. And in particular, seeing the SWP as an organisation which has managers and employers and employs people, and could actually be a place where you could have sexual violence against its own employees. You think about some things that Sadia's been telling us as we've been going along about her being an employee of the organisation. Jen Wilkinson was an employee of the organisation. That's why, when Martin Smith kept on harassing her, why she couldn't say to him in plain, blunt terms, just leave me alone, is because he was her manager and he could have sacked her. Yeah. I don't want to say a lot about Comrade W's story. I think that should come out later in this year as more things emerge. But, some of those dynamics apply to Comrade W too, that it's the organisation treats its staff like a bad organisation treats its workers, but the ordinary members of the organisation are completely incapable of admitting that their organisation employs people, has managers, has workers, and to apply all these politics of women's liberation to that situation. To my mind, it's the problem. It's all those things, all of them fitting together, depressingly, like pieces of a jigsaw. It's the way they all connect that's so destructive in 2013.
Yeah. Just a couple of things that I want to add to that. For me, it kind of felt, as you're saying, very much kind of closing rank protection, being incredibly undemocratic as well. But one of the things, working for the party, and just kind of being very, very kind of heavily involved, very active, there was always this constant like need for protection of the party. Oh, there was always this outside threat. Oh, it's the Socialist Unity blog or other left organizations. They want to attack us. They don't like us. It was always about how terrible these other organizations were and how they were, somehow wanting to bring us down. And there was very much that. But then also there was, the anti-feminism stuff was just, really, really prevalent. And there's one conference that we haven't mentioned is the January 2012 conference. I'm not sure if you were there, David, but so 2011, all the rabble rousing and all of that kind of stuff. So 2012 was the year after that. And I remember there was myself, a number of female colleagues who were clearly quite upset and disturbed by what had happened the year before and had an entire year to think about it. And there was the session on women's liberation, and a number of us spoke about the need for change in the way that, we view women's liberation. And, there were lots of different contributions made. And then there were, and I am going to use the term old guard, there were members of the old guard who got up, and it was like, oh, this is creeping feminism, and like, it was like feminism was such a dirty word. And it was so terrible that, these feminist ideas are coming into the party, and, oh, how would a young working class man feel, in the party at this time, when he's hearing all these women, he'd be feeling very uncomfortable, wouldn't he? I'm not sure if you know about this, David, or yeah. And there's just lots of like, it was just so much opposition to us just saying, yeah, it was really bad what happened last year, and we need to think about, the way we view these things. And it was just kind of just completely closing ranks and just labeling us as feminists, as a bad thing. And then I think, and then just not being able to admit, like you say, not being able to admit that somebody on the leadership, that one of theirs could possibly do anything. And, I remember when I was first told, it was difficult to digest to start with, but then you believe the woman who is standing in front of you, who is completely distraught by what's happened to her, and others who be told in that, initially, all had that kind of initial reaction of disbelief, because it was like, oh, okay. But then that instantly changed. We believe you because we can see that, that you are telling the truth. But for me, it was, if they had just gone, okay, right, this is awful. Let's deal with this properly, and let's, follow proper procedures and deal with it, and, put out a statement and give the correct punishment, they would have integrity today. They have no integrity, and that's what they have shown. But yeah, that's my analysis of it.
I'd just like to share another thought or two about the kind of Marxist anti-feminism of the SWP, because when I came to socialist politics when I was in high school, it was in the Canadian organization, the International Socialists, which was affiliated to the IS Tendency. And so that was the version of politics that I learned, although there were different inflections of it within different groups. And I think that the Canadian IS certainly had some problems around this, but was, I think, in general better than the SWP in terms of how people interpreted and those kind of politics. But in, I think it was 1989, Julie Watterson, who was a member of the Central Committee, spoke at an event which was a joint Canadian and U.S. IS Tendency summer school, and gave a speech in which the phrase, "I hate feminists," was uttered. And it's hard to imagine, like, would you say that about anti-racists? Would you say that about queer liberationists? But that was nevertheless acceptable within the political culture, this kind of idea that all feminists were supporters of some kind of cross-class politics. And this created an environment where, was insulating people against learning from the actually existing struggle against gender oppression. And so the way that then contributed, I think, the SWP in a particular way, but more broadly in the IS Tendency to these kinds of politics is certainly worth thinking about. And the way that, I'm sure lots of SWP members, in a sense, combined formal theory, which was quite bad, with much better politics and practice around these kinds of things. But because these things had not been, because the theory was actually so poor, And because there was opposition to an autonomous women's movement, to women's self-organization within the SWP and women's caucuses and so on, I think it helped, from my perspective, contribute to the situation that developed as it did. That inability to develop a Marxist feminism that really was learning from feminist politics more broadly.
I think that's right, David, but I think you kind of need to make a bit of a distinction for people seeing this in a longer term perspective. You know, there's quite a long tradition on the left of socialist organizations being anti-feminist in a way that's kind of bad, but not that destructive. I mean, you know, if you read closely the writings of Clara Zetkin or Rosa Luxemburg, you know, there's an awful lot of at times just really laying into, bourgeois feminists who just call for the vote. But when you get struggle, that same generation do things like, Clara Zetkin moves the motion the International Women's Day, and the whole program of the first International Women's Day, when the Socialist International adopts it, is to get women to vote. So, there's a way of people do it which just be a little bit annoying, but just, it's not really toxic. The thing about the SWP is Cliff's book about, Cliff's terrible book, his title I keep on forgetting. He wrote it in the early 80s with the Political Project, which is the SWP had a really good, women's organization, Women's Voice. It had a really good magazine, Women's Voice. And the SWP wanted to close that down in a period of, a time when they felt, there wasn't really space for socialist feminism anymore, and women's politics were going to move to the right. Now, whether that analysis was right or wrong, and, I'm generally quite keen on self-organization personally, but whether it was right or wrong, what you see is this thing that you often get on the left, which is people put an argument at one time to get them through one particular conjuncture, and then they keep on arguing the same bloody politics for the next 30 and 40 years in completely different circumstances. And this thing, old Trotsky quote about, was it a little wound becomes gangrene? And I think there's an element of that with the SWP. You could, I'm sure, I've interviewed so many people who were actually part of the opposition in 2013, but are actually quite grateful to the SWP at an earlier point for teaching them some basics of socialist feminist politics, even if the SWP didn't like the word feminism. The problem is, it's just people still carry on fighting this battle after 1980 against this kind of imaginary. I'd been in SWP 10 years, and I'd heard this word, the problem with feminism is they're all lesbian feminists. And I heard that phrase 50 times more often in SWP than I ever did as an activist, listening out to what was going on in the left in the 1990s. And, you get this kind of weird notion of what the arguments of what feminists were having, which, when Rosa Luxemburg and Clara Zetkin polemicized with feminists, they polemicized with real people who they knew, who'd shaped their politics, and knew exactly what they thought, even if they disliked them. Whereas when the SWP polemicized against this stuff, they didn't know what they were talking against.
Well, let's zoom out then, and I'd like to maybe broaden it out and ask you what you think people on the left internationally should learn from this experience of the SWP, and what we would say to someone who draws the conclusion that the SWP crisis proves that socialist groups are inevitably always undemocratic and misogynist.
Why didn't you go, Sadia? I've just been talking.
Okay. I mean, the first thing I would say is just believe women, believe people when they, that is the thing I would have to say. And, I think I have said this already, is that, if they had learned the mistakes that the SWP made, because, if they had have dealt with it properly in the first place and gone, okay, this is what one human being in our organization has done. And no, it wasn't an isolated incident. There are other incidents, but not at not with somebody as senior as Martin was at the time. But yes, somebody in our organization has done this. We are going to deal with it properly and be open and not secretive about it. Then they would have behaved with integrity. They would have still had a level of respect, and maybe they wouldn't have hemorrhaged members in the way that they had. I can't remember the second part of your question.
Oh, just about whether you have any thoughts on what you would say to somebody who says, well, because of what happened with the SWP, that shows that all socialist groups are doomed to be undemocratic and misogynist.
I mean, I don't believe that. I think that, at the time there was just that, I joined the SWP in 2004. Shortly, couple of years after that, there was a crisis in the leadership. Couple of years after that, there was a crisis in the leadership. I think there was a lot of, with the organization at that time, there were a lot of leadership crises, and they were constantly, there was expulsion of John Rees and Lindsay German at one point, and then there were others who were arguing and fighting amongst themselves and stuff. So there was a lot of that going on. And I think, I don't think that it's something that is necessarily unique to the SWP, but I don't think it's something that you can just tar every, far left organization with as well, because there have been other organizations who have had like this and they've dealt with them properly. So I don't think that, all far left organizations are inevitably going to be like this, really. So
look, I agree with Sadia. I mean, you can get sexism, misogyny absolutely anyway. You can get it in right-wing parties, left-wing parties, unions, social movements, whatever. The issue isn't, do you get it? The issue is, when it happens, how do you deal with it? How fast do you deal with it? And the left-wing party and how principled are you? And then the left-wing party ought to be able to do it quicker and in a more principled way, because we thought more deeply about the issues. Instead, what you've got is the SWP that, 12 years later is still trying to work out what its position is about all this bloody stuff. I'm an RS21. I'm a socialist. I believe left-wing people ought to be in a party because the bosses have got all the resources in the world. And how on earth are we ever going to defeat them unless we work together? It's that simple. Just the point is, you don't need to be in a top-down party. Your party doesn't need to be sexist. People can do better. And that's what all the opposition, all the different ways we've gone since, that's what all of us were fighting for in 2013, just to do things the way they should be done.
Well, then, to wrap us up, then, do you have any thoughts about how socialists can do better at building organizations that are democratic, that strive to reduce sexual violence, and that respond appropriately when it happens?
I mean, I think I've kind of already said this a little bit, haven't I? So I don't really want to repeat myself. But I mean, David, have you got anything to add to?
I think I've done what I said I wanted to say about sexism, because honestly, It's just thinking about it better, thinking about it more deeply. As you said, believe women. Personally, I might put that subtly differently. I'd say listen to women. That's the key thing. And listening actually takes time. I think for me, it's a deeper thing than just believing people. You don't believe people till you've heard them, and you just have to listen. But look, in terms of democracy, the SWP has come out of this, and they've said there were lots of problems with our structures. If we had a better disciplinary structure, that would be fine. If we had, they're even sort of tentatively talking about maybe looking at how this current system where the leadership appoints itself for the indefinite future, maybe they might make some tinkering of that at their conference in January. If they kind of redo the structure in these quite subtle and minuscule ways, and everything will be perfect next time. Democracy isn't just about a structure, it's about a culture. It's about 1,000 subtle interactions between people. It's about how serious you are about letting everyone be part of making decisions. And that includes the youngest, most junior people. It includes women. That should be pretty obvious. And it's just about having a culture where you don't have these permanent leaders, like we mentioned, Kalinikos, who'd been there 30 years, 40 years now until his resignation now, because finally admitting the pressure of events. But it's about saying, the new people there, they can be part of making decisions too. They might have knowledge and activist information and experience and expertise, which actually everyone can draw from. And they're just as important and they're just as powerful and they've got just as much right to speak.
Yeah.
And it's about creating culture where everyone can contribute. To my mind, do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go on, Sadia, you say something.
No, I was just going to say that, just not labeling anybody who disagrees as an oppositionist. And I think that was very much part of the culture. Certainly when I was in it, that, you'd have the meeting before the meeting, you'd have the meeting before the meeting before the meeting to make sure that, everybody was on side and everybody was going to vote a certain way. And, and if there was anybody who was, who had an alternative view or who was opposed or disagreed, you're just an oppositionist. And I think very much, agreeing with what you're saying really is just not doing that. And, you know, having, you know, listening to people and listening to alternative views as well. And not just kind of dismissing those with less experience as just, oh, you're young, you don't know anything. We're going to listen to, you know, the people who have been in the party for 40 plus years or whatever. Yeah, very much listen to people and change.
Look, that's, to my mind, it's about, we were revolutionaries. You know, everyone here, you've heard Sadia. We were revolutionaries. We saw the Revolutionary Party as itself a terrain of struggle, and we took all that thing which normally we fire against the bosses, normally we fire against the sexists and racists. Just, we had to turn it against our own organisation, but people did. That's the point. We didn't give up on all that training we've been taught. We took the best of it, and we're trying to take it in all our different ways into the future, whatever we can do with it.
So thank you both for that. And I wanted to encourage listeners as well to check out David Renton's book, Comrade Delta. The information about that book will be in the show notes for this episode. I think it's a contribution to understanding in detail what happened in Britain that can be of use to socialists everywhere as we work to try to build a socialist politics that's genuinely committed to all forms of human liberation and in thoroughly democratic organizing as we go forward. So again, Sadia and David, thanks so much for your time on this.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcasts wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.